In the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt, in that liminal threshold where the known meets the vast expanse of mystery, lives the possibility of transformation. It is often at the edges of our understanding where the most profound shifts in consciousness occur, not with thunderous declaration, but with the gentle whisper of a question that cannot be silenced. For Dr. Raymond Moody, that whisper began in 1965, an ordinary day that would ultimately alter the course of his life and, perhaps more significantly, our collective understanding of what happens when we die. Moody was not predisposed to mysticism, quite the contrary. A rigorous philosopher by training and a physician by profession, he had been shaped by the hard edges of empirical thought, the Cartesian separation of mind and matter, and the scientific method that demanded observable evidence. His world was one of order and reason, where phenomena could be categorized, measured, and explained through the careful application of logic. The transcendent, if acknowledged at all, was relegated to the realm of subjective experience. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately unreliable as a source of knowledge about reality. In the academic climate of mid-20th century America, this position was not merely accepted, it was expected. The intellectual landscape had largely dismissed experiences that fell outside the narrow confines of materialist understanding. Consciousness was viewed as nothing more than an epiphenomenon of brain activity, and death represented the irrevocable end of personal existence. These were not merely hypotheses, but axiomatic truths among the educated elite. To suggest otherwise was to risk relegation to the fringes of serious intellectual discourse, and yet it was within this context of certainty that Moody's certainties began to unravel. It happened unexpectedly during his residency at a hospital in Virginia. A patient, a man in his 50s who had been resuscitated after his heart had stopped, recounted something extraordinary. "Doctor," he said, his eyes carrying a luminosity that seemed out of place in the sterile hospital room, "I was gone, really gone, and what I saw—" He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the experience. "What I saw changes everything." The man described floating above his body, watching as medical staff worked frantically to resuscitate him. He recalled drifting through a dark passageway toward a light of indescribable brilliance. He spoke of a profound peace, a sense of being enveloped in unconditional love, and of encountering deceased relatives who seemed more alive than ever. Most strikingly, he described a panoramic review of his entire life, not merely as a passive observer, but as one who could feel both the joy and pain he had caused others throughout his years on Earth. Moody listened with the detached interest of a scientist encountering an anomalous data point. Curious, certainly, but not yet transformative. He filed the account away mentally, perhaps as an interesting anecdote to share with colleagues, or as evidence of the remarkable ways the brain might respond to oxygen deprivation. Yet something about the man's conviction, the clarity with which he recounted the experience and the profound effect it had clearly had on him, planted a seed of inquiry in Moody's mind that would not be easily dismissed. The encounter might have remained just that, an isolated curiosity, had Moody not begun to notice patterns. Other patients, entirely unaware of each other's experiences, began to recount strikingly similar narratives. A woman described the same tunnel, the same light, the same life review. A man who had never met the first patient spoke of dead relatives, greeting him in a realm that felt more real than real. These were not vague impressions or dreamlike states, but vivid, coherent experiences that patients insisted were fundamentally different from dreams or hallucinations. What began as casual curiosity evolved into methodical inquiry. Moody, the philosopher trained in careful analysis, began to document these accounts. Initially, he approached them with the cool detachment of a scientist collecting specimens, fascinating phenomena to be cataloged and explained within the existing paradigm of neurological understanding. Yet with each new account, each convergent detail from patients who had no knowledge of one another's experiences, the explanatory framework he had relied upon began to show cracks. The question that had been a whisper grew louder. What if consciousness was not merely a product of brain activity? What if there was something more, something that persisted beyond the threshold of what we call death? These questions were not comfortable ones for a man steeped in the materialist worldview of modern medicine. They threatened not merely a theory but an entire framework of understanding, a way of making sense of reality that had guided his education and early career. The tension between what Moody had been taught and what he was now witnessing created a cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. He found himself standing at a crossroads of understanding, pulled between the solid ground of his scientific training and the uncharted territory these experiences seemed to reveal. It was not a comfortable place to be, straddling worlds, belonging fully to neither the camp of believers nor the ranks of dismissive skeptics. This intellectual liminality mirrored the very experiences he was studying, those moments between life and death, where individuals reported inhabiting a space between worlds. There was something poetically appropriate about this parallel, though Moody would only recognize it years later. For now he was simply a scientist confronted with data that did not fit neatly into the prevailing paradigm, a philosopher encountering questions that the dominant philosophical framework of his time was ill-equipped to address. As more accounts accumulated, patterns emerged with such consistency that they could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence or culturally conditioned fantasies. The tunnel, the light, the presence of deceased loved ones, the life review, the reluctant return. These elements appeared across demographic boundaries in the experiences of the religious and non-religious alike, in those who had prior knowledge of such phenomena and those who had none. What had begun as a whisper had become a persistent voice, calling Moody toward a profound reconsideration of everything he thought he knew about consciousness, about death, and ultimately about the nature of human existence itself. The rational mind that had been his guide was now confronted with a territory where reason alone seemed insufficient, where empirical methodology reached its limits and something more was required. It was the beginning of a journey that would transform not only Moody's understanding, but would eventually challenge the collective certainties of an entire culture. And so, with the cautious steps of a scientist and the open mind of a true philosopher, Raymond Moody began to walk a path that few before him had dared to tread, a path that would lead from skepticism to wonder, from dismissal to deep engagement with the greatest mystery that faces every human being. What awaits us beyond the threshold of death? The answers he would discover would shake the foundations not only of his own beliefs, but of our cultural understanding of mortality itself. In the years that followed that first encounter, Moody's investigation took on the methodical precision that defined his scientific training. He began collecting accounts systematically, interviewing hundreds of individuals who had been pronounced clinically dead and subsequently resuscitated. He approached this work not as a mystic seeking confirmation of spiritual beliefs, but as a researcher documenting a phenomenon that demanded serious inquiry. Each account was meticulously recorded, analyzed for internal consistency, and compared with others to identify recurring patterns. What emerged from this rigorous process was nothing short of extraordinary. Despite differences in age, cultural background, religious belief, and education, those who had experienced clinical death reported remarkably similar journeys. The dark tunnel transitioning to brilliant light, the ineffable sense of peace and well-being, the encounter with deceased relatives or spiritual beings radiating unconditional love. The panoramic life review experienced not just visually but emotionally, feeling both the joy and pain they had caused others, and perhaps most significantly, the profound reluctance to return to physical existence after experiencing such transcendent states. For Moody, these patterns presented a profound intellectual challenge. His training in both philosophy and medicine had instilled in him a deeply materialist worldview, one in which consciousness was understood as nothing more than the byproduct of neurological processes, and death represented the absolute end of personal existence. The consistency and depth of these near-death experiences began to undermine this foundational assumption, suggesting possibilities that extended beyond the limits of the materialist paradigm. The conflict this created was not merely intellectual, but deeply personal. To consider seriously the implications of these accounts was to question the very framework that had guided his understanding of reality. It meant standing apart from colleagues who dismissed such experiences as mere hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation or the release of endorphins in the dying brain. It meant risking his professional reputation in a field that regarded any consideration of consciousness beyond the physical brain as dangerously close to pseudoscience. Yet the evidence before him was compelling in ways that could not be easily dismissed. The lucidity with which individuals recalled these experiences, often describing them as more real than real, contrasted sharply with the confused, fragmented nature of hallucination. The life-transforming impact these experiences had on those who underwent them suggested something far more significant than a neurochemical event. Most challenging of all was the occasional verification of details that individuals could not possibly have known through ordinary means. Accurate descriptions of resuscitation procedures performed while they were clinically dead, or conversations occurring in hospital corridors far from their physical bodies. Moody's philosophical training now proved both a burden and a gift. A burden because it had instilled in him a commitment to materialist explanations that these experiences seemed to transcend. A gift because it had also taught him to question underlying assumptions and to follow evidence wherever it might lead. He began to realize that the academic rejection of near-death experiences reflected not scientific rigor, but philosophical bias. A predetermined conclusion that such experiences must be explicable within the materialist framework, because the materialist framework was assumed to be complete. This realization marked a crucial turning point in Moody's intellectual journey. He began to see that true scientific inquiry required openness to phenomena that might challenge existing paradigms. After all, the history of science was not a linear progression of confirmed hypotheses, but a series of paradigm shifts, each precipitated by anomalous data that could not be explained within existing frameworks. Perhaps near-death experiences represented just such anomalous data, not proof of any particular religious or spiritual interpretation, but evidence that our understanding of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality remained incomplete. Moody deepened his investigation. He discovered something equally surprising. The near-death experience was not a modern phenomenon. Accounts remarkably similar to those he was documenting appeared in ancient philosophical and religious texts from disparate cultures spanning thousands of years. Plato's myth of air in the Republic described a soldier who died in battle, witnessed the afterlife, and returned to tell it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead detailed transitions between death and rebirth that paralleled modern accounts. Indigenous shamanic traditions worldwide spoke of journeys to other realms during states near death. This historical and cross-cultural consistency further challenged the dismissal of near-death experiences as mere hallucinations. If these were simply products of oxygen-starved brains, why would they maintain such consistent patterns across vastly different times and cultures? Why would they cohere into narratives that not only made internal sense but aligned with accounts from individuals separated by millennia and continents? The questions multiplied, and with each new question, the solid ground of Moody's materialist certainty eroded further. He found himself increasingly isolated professionally, occupying a precarious position between the skepticism of his medical colleagues and the uncritical acceptance often found in spiritual circles. Neither pole satisfied his commitment to honest inquiry. He sought not confirmation of pre-existing beliefs, but understanding of a phenomenon that seemed to transcend the boundaries between science and spirituality. This intellectual isolation was mirrored by a growing sense of personal transformation. The hundreds of accounts he had collected were not merely data points, but profound human experiences that spoke to the deepest questions of existence. Those who had undergone near-death experiences often emerged fundamentally changed, less materialistic, more compassionate, less afraid of death, more convinced of life's ultimate meaning and purpose. Their certainty was not dogmatic, but experiential, grounded in what they insisted was direct knowledge rather than belief. Moody began to wonder, what if these experiences contained a truth that transcended both religious doctrine and scientific materialism? What if they pointed toward aspects of reality that our ordinary consciousness, adapted for physical survival rather than metaphysical insight, could not normally access? What if the brain, rather than generating consciousness, acted as a filter or receiver, limiting our awareness to the narrow band of perception necessary for biological existence, but occasionally, in extraordinary circumstances, allowing glimpses of a broader reality? These questions were not comfortable ones for a man trained in the rigorous skepticism of academic philosophy and medicine. Yet as the evidence accumulated, as the patterns became increasingly difficult to dismiss within conventional frameworks, Moody reached a critical threshold. The weight of these consistent transformative experiences demanded serious consideration, even at the cost of professional ridicule and personal uncertainty. In 1975, after years of careful research and profound internal struggle, Moody took the step that would forever change both his life and our collective understanding of death. He published Life After Life, a book documenting his findings and introducing the term near-death experience to the lexicon. The book presented the accounts he had collected not as proof of any particular religious interpretation, but as evidence of a phenomenon that demanded serious scientific and philosophical attention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Life After Life became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions worldwide. Letters poured in from readers who had undergone similar experiences but had kept them secret, fearing ridicule or psychiatric diagnosis. Medical professionals began to report encounters with patients whose experiences mirrored those Moody had documented. What had been hidden suddenly became visible, not because it hadn't existed before, but because Moody had provided a framework and language that legitimized its discussion. For Moody himself, the publication marked not an end but a beginning, the NDE moment when his private intellectual journey became a public conversation that would expand far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The skeptical philosopher who had stumbled upon an anomalous phenomenon had become, almost despite himself, the pioneer of a new field of inquiry that would challenge our most fundamental assumptions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of human existence. The success of Life After Life thrust Raymond Moody into a spotlight he had never sought. The quiet physician and philosopher now found himself at the center of a cultural phenomenon, invited to speak at conferences worldwide, interviewed by major media outlets, and approached by countless individuals eager to share their own near-death accounts. For a man who had valued the contemplative solitude of academic inquiry, this sudden visibility was both overwhelming and transformative. Yet the public attention was secondary to the profound internal transformation unfolding within Moody himself. The hundreds of near-death accounts he had documented were not merely data to be analyzed, but testimonies that resonated at the deepest levels of human experience. Each story of journeying beyond the threshold of death carried with it questions that could not be neatly filed away once the interview concluded. They lingered, echoing in the quiet moments between his public appearances, challenging not just his intellectual framework, but his personal relationship with mortality. Moody began to recognize that his investigation of near-death experiences had ceased to be merely an academic pursuit. It had become a deeply personal journey, one that was gradually reshaping his understanding of consciousness, reality, and his own place within the cosmos. The skeptical scientist who had approached these accounts with detached curiosity was evolving into someone capable of entertaining possibilities that his younger self would have dismissed without consideration. This evolution did not represent an abandonment of critical thinking, but rather its expansion. Moody began to develop new conceptual frameworks that could accommodate both the rigor of scientific methodology and the profound implications of near-death experiences. He was not content with either dogmatic materialism or uncritical spiritualism. Instead, he sought a third path, one that honored both empirical evidence and subjective experience, recognizing that a complete understanding of consciousness might require both approaches. In his book The Light Beyond, published several years after Life After Life, Moody reflected on this conceptual evolution. I have come to believe that how we respond to the evidence for near-death experiences depends very much on how we understand the nature of perception and reality. The traditional scientific approach has been to assume that the external world has an objective existence independent of our perception of it. But what if consciousness itself is more fundamental? This questioning of the primacy of matter over mind represented a profound philosophical shift. Moody began to consider models of reality in which consciousness was not merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity, but something more fundamental, perhaps even the ground of being from which physical reality emerged. Such perspectives were not new. They had deep roots in philosophical traditions ranging from idealism to certain interpretations of quantum physics. But they had been largely marginalized in the materialist paradigm that dominated contemporary scientific discourse. Moody's willingness to entertain such possibilities was not born of naive credulity, but of an honest reckoning with evidence that resisted conventional explanation. The consistent patterns in near-death experiences, their transformative impact, and occasionally their veridical elements, accurate reports of events that occurred while the experiencer was clinically dead, suggested that consciousness might indeed extend beyond the physical brain in ways that challenged the prevailing scientific paradigm. This philosophical reorientation was mirrored by personal changes that surprised even Moody himself. The man who had once approached death with the clinical detachment of a physician began to view it with a sense of wonder and possibility. His fear of mortality, while not eliminated, was transformed. Death no longer appeared as an absolute endpoint, but as a threshold, a transition whose nature remained mysterious, but which thousands of near-death experiences suggested might hold profound significance. This shift was not merely intellectual but emotional and spiritual. Moody found himself drawn to questions that had once seemed irrelevant to serious academic inquiry. What is the purpose of human existence? What constitutes a life well lived? What remains when the physical body ceases to function? The near-death experiences he had documented consistently suggested answers to these questions, answers centered on love, compassion, learning, and growth, rather than material acquisition or social status. Dreams began to take on new significance. In Moody's life during this period, he reported experiences of unusual lucidity and depth, sometimes involving encounters with deceased individuals or explorations of realms that bore striking similarities to those described by near-death experiencers. These dreams further challenged his understanding of consciousness, suggesting that ordinary sleep might occasionally provide access to dimensions of experience beyond our waking awareness. Moody's perspective on his medical practice underwent a parallel transformation. Where he had once seen patients primarily as biological systems requiring technical intervention, he now perceived them as conscious beings with experiences that transcended their physical condition. This shift did not diminish his commitment to medical excellence, but enriched it, allowing him to address not only the physiological dimensions of illness, but also its meaning in the broader context of a patient's life journey. This holistic approach was particularly evident in his work with dying patients. Rather than viewing death merely as a medical failure to be postponed at all costs, Moody began to recognize it as a significant life transition deserving of attention, preparation, and respect. He became an early advocate for improved end-of-life care, arguing that our cultural denial of death often resulted in unnecessary suffering and missed opportunities for meaningful closure. The evolution in Moody's thinking was not without its challenges and dark nights of the soul. There were moments of doubt when the materialist explanations he had been taught reasserted themselves, suggesting that the entire phenomenon might indeed be reducible to neurochemical processes in the dying brain. There were times when the magnitude of what was at stake, nothing less than our understanding of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality, felt overwhelming. What sustained him through these periods of uncertainty was not blind faith, but the consistent testimony of those who had experienced clinical death. Their accounts spoke not only of another dimension of reality, but of an encounter with unconditional love so profound that it transformed their entire orientation to life. This aspect of the near-death experience, the encounter with what many described as an omniscient, loving presence, resonated across religious and cultural boundaries, suggesting something that transcended particular belief systems. Moody was careful not to impose religious interpretations on these experiences. He recognized that while near-death accounts often aligned with spiritual perspectives, they did not validate any specific religious doctrine. What they suggested was both simpler and more profound, that love, compassion, and personal growth hold cosmic significance that transcends our brief physical existence. This was not religion in the conventional sense, but a direct apprehension of meaning and purpose that required no institutional mediation. As his understanding deepened, Moody began to see near-death experiences not as isolated anomalies, but as glimpses of a broader reality occasionally accessible during extraordinary, states of consciousness. This perspective led him to explore the commonalities between near-death experiences and other transformative states, mystical experiences, deep meditation, certain psychedelic journeys, and even moments of profound aesthetic or emotional impact that temporarily dissolve ordinary boundaries of self. What emerged was a more expansive model of human consciousness, one in which our ordinary waking awareness represented not the totality of consciousness, but a narrow band optimized for physical survival. In this model, near-death experiences occurred when the constraints that normally limit consciousness to this narrow band were temporarily lifted, allowing access to dimensions of reality that remain inaccessible during ordinary states. This model did not negate the importance of the brain, but reconceptualized its role. Rather than generating consciousness, the brain might function as a transducer or filter, processing and limiting the vast field of consciousness to the specific inputs needed for biological functioning. When this filtering mechanism was temporarily altered through clinical death, meditation, or other means, broader dimensions of consciousness might become accessible. For Moody, this evolving understanding was never static or dogmatic. It remained a working hypothesis, continuously refined through engagement with new evidence and perspectives. What had begun as an investigation into an anomalous phenomenon had become a lifelong exploration of the most fundamental questions of human existence, an exploration that would continue to unfold in unexpected ways in the decades to come. As Moody's exploration deepened, he found himself drawn to investigate not only near-death experiences themselves, but the broader territory of consciousness they suggested. If these experiences revealed dimensions of awareness beyond ordinary perception, might there be other methods of accessing such expanded states? This question led him toward one of his most innovative and controversial contributions, the development of what he called the psychomantium. Inspired by the ancient Greek oracles at Ephora, where people reportedly communicated with the deceased, Moody created a modern equivalent, a carefully designed space that facilitated profound alterations in consciousness. The psychomantium consisted of a small, darkened room with a mirror positioned at an angle that prevented viewers from seeing their own reflection. In this setting, after appropriate preparation, individuals would gaze into the mirror for extended periods, often with the intention of connecting with deceased loved ones. The results surprised even Moody. Many participants reported extraordinary experiences, vivid encounters with departed family members, meaningful communications, and emotional healing that had eluded them through conventional grief counseling. These were not the vague impressions of mediumship, but direct personal experiences that carried profound emotional and psychological impact. For Moody, the psychomantium represented not a supernatural intervention, but a technology for accessing latent human capacities, a tool that enabled individuals to temporarily transcend the limitations of ordinary perception. This work with the psychomantium reflected a significant evolution in Moody's approach. He had moved beyond merely documenting near-death experiences to actively exploring methods of inducing similarly transformative states. This shift was not without controversy. Critics accused him of abandoning scientific objectivity for mystical speculation, of crossing the line from researcher to practitioner of questionable psychological techniques. Moody acknowledged these concerns but refused to be constrained by them. Throughout history, he wrote, the expansion of knowledge has required venturing beyond established methodologies. If consciousness extends beyond what our current scientific paradigm can measure, then we need new approaches, not to replace scientific rigor but to complement it in domains where traditional methods prove insufficient. This willingness to pioneer new methodologies reflected Moody's growing recognition that near-death experiences belonged to a broader category of transformative encounters that had been reported across cultures and throughout history. He began extensive cross-cultural research, examining how different societies interpreted and integrated experiences of expanded consciousness. From the shamanic journeys of indigenous peoples to the mystical traditions of world religions, he discovered striking parallels to the accounts he had documented from modern near-death experiencers. This comparative work revealed that what made near-death experiences unprecedented was not their content, but their context. The basic phenomenology, the journey through darkness toward light, encounters with deceased loved ones or spiritual beings, panoramic life reviews, and transformative insights appeared in countless cultural traditions. What distinguished modern near-death experiences was their occurrence in medical settings, where physical parameters could be monitored and within a cultural framework that had largely dismissed such experiences as impossible. Moody found this cross-cultural consistency profoundly significant. If these experiences were merely hallucinations produced by dying brains, why would they maintain such coherent patterns across vastly different cultural contexts? Why would they consistently involve elements, such as the life review or the encounter with universal love, that transcended specific religious doctrines? The parallels suggested not cultural contamination, but something more fundamental, perhaps universal aspects of human consciousness revealed under extraordinary circumstances. This recognition led Moody to develop a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between near-death experiences and cultural expectations. Rather than seeing culture as determining these experiences, he came to view it as providing the interpretive framework through which universal experiences were understood and expressed. A Christian might describe encountering Jesus, a Hindu might meet Krishna, while a secular individual might speak of an undefined, loving presence. Yet the essential quality of unconditional love and acceptance remained consistent across these varying interpretations. As his research expanded, Moody found himself increasingly drawn to philosophical questions about the nature of language itself. How could any vocabulary, developed for describing ordinary physical reality, adequately capture experiences that transcended that reality? The limitations of language became particularly apparent when near-death experiencers attempted to describe the ineffable quality of their journeys, often resorting to phrases like more real than real or beyond words. This linguistic challenge inspired one of Moody's most significant conceptual contributions, the recognition that near-death experiences required not just new theories but new forms of discourse. In his book, The Last Laugh, he explored the use of paradox, metaphor, and even humor as means of communicating insights that defied literal expression. He suggested that the mysterious nature of these experiences might be better approached through poetry than proposition, through narrative rather than analysis. This linguistic turn reflected Moody's growing awareness that near-death experiences challenge not just specific scientific theories, but the very epistemological foundations of materialist thought. If consciousness could access realms beyond physical reality, then empirical observation alone, the cornerstone of scientific methodology, might prove insufficient for a complete understanding of human experience. Other ways of knowing, including direct subjective apprehension, might be equally valid in certain domains. This position placed Moody in an intellectually lonely terrain, neither fully aligned with conventional science nor with uncritical spirituality. Scientific colleagues often dismissed his work for its openness to non-material explanations, while spiritual communities sometimes mistook his careful, nuanced explorations for unconditional endorsement of their particular belief systems. He found himself occupying what he called the excluded middle, the terrain between dogmatic materialism and uncritical faith. Yet it was precisely this middle position that allowed Moody to make his most significant contributions. By maintaining both critical rigor and openness to extraordinary possibilities, he created space for honest exploration of experiences that had been prematurely dismissed by mainstream science, yet deserved more careful scrutiny than most spiritual interpretations provided. This balanced approach gradually attracted others who shared his commitment to exploring consciousness without predetermined conclusions. The intellectual isolation Moody experienced was matched by personal challenges. His willingness to investigate phenomena beyond the materialist paradigm sometimes led to professional marginalization and criticism. There were periods of self-doubt when he questioned whether his entire research program might represent a misguided journey down an epistemological dead end. The stakes were high, not just his professional reputation but his understanding of reality itself. What sustained him through these difficulties was the consistent testimony of those who had experienced clinical death. Their accounts spoke not of vague spiritual notions, but of direct, transformative encounters with dimensions of reality that fundamentally altered their understanding of existence. The courage with which many shared deeply personal experiences, often risking ridicule and disbelief, inspired Moody to continue his investigations despite the professional costs. As his understanding evolved, Moody began to recognize that the significance of near-death experiences extended far beyond questions of survival after physical death. Whether or not consciousness continued in some form, these experiences revealed aspects of human psychology that had profound implications for how we live. The Life Review, in particular, with its emphasis on empathy and compassion, suggested ethical dimensions that transcended particular religious frameworks. Near-death experiencers consistently reported that during their life reviews, the most significant events were not achievements or acquisitions, but moments of kindness or cruelty, love given or withheld. They experienced not only their own emotions, but those of others affected by their action, feeling the pain they had caused and the joy they had created. This suggested a cosmos in which empathy was not merely a subjective psychological state, but an objective moral reality, a universe in which how we treat one another matters in ways that transcend social convention. This ethical dimension became increasingly central to Moody's work. Beyond questions of survival or the nature of consciousness, near-death experiences pointed toward a vision of human flourishing based not on material success or social status, but on compassion, learning, and growth. They suggested that a life well lived was measured not by what one accumulated, but by what one became, by the development of qualities that enhanced rather than diminished the lives of others. This vision aligned with philosophical traditions, ranging from Aristotle's eudaimonia to Buddhist conceptions of enlightenment, suggesting that despite their apparent novelty, near-death experiences might be revealing perennial truths about human fulfillment that had been articulated by wisdom traditions throughout history. What made them significant in the contemporary context was their emergence within a culture that had largely lost touch with these deeper dimensions of human experience. As the decades passed, Moody's work evolved from a focused investigation of near-death experiences to a broader exploration of the implications these experiences held for our understanding of consciousness, reality, and human potential. What had begun as a medical curiosity had matured into a comprehensive philosophical vision, one that offered not only theoretical insights, but practical wisdom for navigating the complexities of human existence. Central to this mature philosophy was Moody's concept of rational mysticism, an approach that honored both the rigor of critical thinking and the reality of transcendent experience. Rather than seeing reason and mystical insight as opposed, Moody suggested they were complementary modes of knowing, each illuminating aspects of reality that the other might miss. The rational mind could provide clarity, precision, and protection from self-deception, while mystical experience offered depth, meaning, and connection to dimensions beyond ordinary awareness. This integration of seemingly opposite approaches reflected Moody's own journey from skeptical physician to philosophical explorer of consciousness. He had not abandoned his commitment to intellectual integrity, but had expanded it to include domains of experience that his earlier materialist framework had excluded. The result was neither uncritical spirituality nor dogmatic skepticism, but a third position, one that remained open to evidence from all sources while maintaining rigorous standards for its evaluation. This philosophical synthesis allowed Moody to make unique contributions to both scientific and spiritual discourse. To the scientific community, he offered evidence that consciousness might be more complex and extensive than materialist models suggested. To spiritual seekers, he provided an approach grounded in careful investigation rather than mere belief or authority. By occupying the borderland between these domains, he created possibilities for dialogue where previously there had been only mutual dismissal. Perhaps most significantly, Moody's work helped legitimize the study of consciousness itself as a valid scientific pursuit. When he began his investigations in the 1960s, consciousness was viewed by many scientists as too subjective for serious research, a black box better left to philosophers than empirical investigators. By documenting patterns in near-death experiences that demanded explanation, Moody helped catalyze what would eventually become the interdisciplinary field of consciousness studies. This field has since expanded far beyond near-death research to include neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and various contemplative traditions, all focused on understanding the nature and potential of human awareness. While debates continue about the ultimate nature of consciousness, the legitimacy of studying it empirically is now widely accepted. This shift represents one of Moody's most enduring contributions, helping to bring questions of consciousness from the margins of science to its mainstream. The implications of Moody's work extend beyond academic discourse to practical questions of how we live and die. His research consistently suggested that those who had glimpsed dimensions beyond physical existence returned with profoundly altered priorities. Material success, social status, and even intellectual achievement became secondary to qualities like compassion, authenticity, and presence. These transformed values weren't abstract principles, but lived realities that reshaped how near-death experiencers engaged with everyday life. This practical wisdom offers a counterpoint to contemporary cultures often characterized by materialism, individualism, and disconnection. Near-death experiences suggest that a life aligned with our deepest nature is one oriented toward connection rather than separation, toward giving rather than accumulating, toward growth rather than stasis. They point toward a way of being that many philosophical and spiritual traditions have identified as the path to genuine fulfillment. Particularly significant is how near-death experiences transform the relationship with mortality itself. Those who have temporarily crossed the threshold of death typically return with dramatically reduced fear, not because they have faith in particular religious doctrines, but because they have directly experienced dimensions beyond physical existence. This transformed relationship with death often leads to a more conscious, intentional engagement with life, freed from the anxious avoidance that characterizes much of our cultural approach to mortality. Moody's work thus offers not just theoretical insights, but practical wisdom for navigating one of humanity's greatest challenges, our awareness of our own mortality. By documenting how direct encounters with death can lead to more meaningful living, he provides a perspective that transcends specific religious frameworks while honoring the profound questions they address. This contribution becomes increasingly relevant in pluralistic societies where traditional religious approaches to death and meaning no longer speak to many individuals. The evolution of Moody's thinking reflects broader shifts in contemporary culture, from rigid materialist reductionism toward more integrative approaches that honor both objective and subjective dimensions of reality. While scientific materialism continues to dominate many academic and medical institutions, there is growing recognition that a complete understanding of human experience requires perspectives that transcend this limited framework. This cultural evolution is evident in developments ranging from integrative medicine to contemplative neuroscience, fields that once would have been dismissed as fringe but now attract serious research funding and institutional support. While Moody was certainly not solely responsible for these shifts, his pioneering work helped create intellectual space for approaches that bridge scientific methodology and the exploration of consciousness in all its dimensions. When reflecting on his journey from skeptical physician to philosophical explorer, Moody often emphasized that the transformation was not a rejection of his scientific training, but its expansion. True science, he wrote, is not defined by adherence to particular theories, but by commitment to honest inquiry, to following evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges our most fundamental assumptions. This perspective embodies the integration of rational and mystical approaches that characterized his mature philosophy. The courage this position required should not be underestimated. Throughout his career, Moody faced criticism from multiple directions, from scientific colleagues who considered his work dangerously speculative, from religious conservatives who feared it undermined traditional doctrines, and from uncritical believers who mistook his careful investigations for unconditional endorsement of their particular interpretations. Navigating these cross-currents required not just intellectual clarity, but personal resilience. What sustained this resilience was not dogmatic certainty, but profound wonder, the sense of standing before mysteries that transcended complete human understanding. Moody often described himself not as someone who had found final answers, but as an explorer mapping previously uncharted territories of consciousness. This humility in the face of mystery prevented his evolving philosophy from hardening into dogma and kept it open to continuous refinement through new evidence and insight. This quality of wonder is perhaps Moody's most significant legacy, not just to academic discourse, but to our collective approach to existence itself. In a culture often characterized by either cynical dismissal or uncritical belief, he exemplified a third possibility: the capacity to stand before the great mysteries of consciousness, death, and meaning with both critical intelligence and open-hearted receptivity. This stance creates space for genuine exploration, unconstrained by predetermined conclusions. For those encountering Moody's work today, this legacy offers an invitation, not to accept particular theories or beliefs, but to engage directly with the fundamental questions of human existence. What is consciousness, and how does it relate to physical reality? Does something of our awareness continue beyond physical death? What constitutes a life well lived in light of our mortality? These questions transcend academic disciplines and religious traditions, touching the core of what it means to be human. The near-death experiences that Moody documented suggest that engaging these questions is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a journey with profound practical implications. Those who have glimpsed dimensions beyond ordinary awareness consistently report that love, compassion, and growth matter in ways that transcend cultural conventions or personal preferences. They describe a cosmos in which how we treat one another and how we develop as conscious beings has significance that extends beyond our brief physical existence. Whether or not one accepts particular interpretations of near-death experiences, this ethical vision offers wisdom for navigating contemporary challenges. In a world often fragmented by conflicting ideologies and disconnected from deeper sources of meaning, it points toward possibilities for living that honor both our individual uniqueness and our fundamental interconnection. It suggests that beneath the surface differences that often divide us lies a shared human journey toward greater awareness, compassion, and understanding. Raymond Moody's transformation from skeptical physician to philosophical explorer thus offers more than an interesting biographical narrative or specialized academic contribution. It represents a broader possibility, the potential for integrating rational inquiry and mystical insight, scientific methodology and direct experience, intellectual rigor and open-hearted wonder. In this integration lies not just theoretical understanding but practical wisdom for living consciously in the face of the greatest mystery we all must eventually confront. The journey that began with a single patient's account of traveling beyond death ultimately opened into an exploration of consciousness itself, its nature, its potential, and its possible continuation beyond physical existence. While definitive answers to these questions may remain beyond our complete grasp, Moody's work reminds us that honest inquiry into them enriches our living regardless of what awaits beyond our final breath. In this recognition lies perhaps his most enduring legacy: the understanding that how we approach the mystery of death profoundly shapes the quality of our engagement with life.